One early review in particular seems to get a lot of...
Excuse me, Reg?
What?
I believe you're sitting in my spot.
Oh. Yeah, alright.
Editing Matt?
Oh, thanks. Ooh. Nostalgic perspective. Oh, I remember why I liked this area. Oh, hey, thanks for the beard trim, Editing Matt. Maybe a little close, though. Oh, Reg, you all set? Oh, yeah. I remember this. It's a lot easier on my legs, too. Well, anyway, as I was saying, one early review that seems to get a lot of critical and sometimes borderline nasty comments is the third Books vs. Movies review I ever did on The Wizard of Oz. During the course of that review, I discovered that I don't particularly care for L. Frank Baum's book. I felt that the story was rather sloppily told and at times dull and pedantic. Though it most certainly has a place in history and culture as a groundbreaking children's story, I don't think that the story has held up terribly well. Though my opinion of the book hasn't really changed that much, I do feel that both book and movie deserve more than what I originally gave them. Both of them are cultural icons, and if we're really gonna get technical, this was my first Books vs. Movies review tiebreaker, and it should be treated as such. So I'd like to look deeper into some of the aspects of both stories and address some of the criticisms of my original review. That being said, let's turn back the clock a couple of years and take another look at my third Books vs. Movies review, The Wizard of Oz. One of the changes we've made in the last 2 years is that we now allow reviews to be more than just 5 rounds long. So this review is going to get the 7-round treatment, touching on a couple of categories that I didn't really talk about the last time or folded into other categories. With that said, let's get started with our original round 1, looking at the protagonist, Dorothy Gale. In the original review, I basically went on a big rant about how this character has very few redeeming characteristics and is basically just dull, uninteresting, and bland. Which admittedly are 3 words that mean the same thing, but we're gonna move on. And that while movie character isn't that much better, she's still marginally better, and so movie got the point. Now, my opinion of the character of Dorothy in the book has not really changed all that much. I do think that she's kind of bland and boring and has very few interesting characteristics, but I do want to talk a little bit about the benefits of creating such a character. I touched on this a little bit in my Alice in Wonderland and Coraline reviews, both of which have kind of bland protagonists as well, but there is actually a purpose to making a character this way. By essentially making a character into an empty vessel, you allow the reader to put himself, or let's be honest here, more often herself, into the place of the protagonist. It becomes a lot easier to see yourself as the protagonist and to apply your own personalities to that protagonist if the character doesn't have that many defining characteristics to begin with. And that's basically what Baum is trying to do here. The whole purpose of this book is to open up a child's imagination, and it becomes a lot easier for a child to imagine if he or she can see himself or herself in the story. All that being said, however, I still found this character to just be pretty boring. And really, the character in the movie is pretty much just an empty vessel too, but there are a number of aspects that make her a little bit more interesting. First of all, there's her fervent desire to just go home, which never really wavers. Dorothy in the book wants to go home too, but she's a little more flighty and sometimes forgets about her home in the face of all the wonders of Oz. Dorothy in the movie never does. She still takes everything that Oz has to offer, but she never forgets her main objective. She wants to go home, and everything that she does is working towards that goal. And she's also wide-eyed and innocent and pretty, which helps as well. Also, she can actually cry convincingly, unlike some child actors at the time, and so when she breaks down and cries after being denied access to the wizard, it's legitimately heartbreaking. And really, let's be honest, we fell in love with this character as soon as Judy Garland sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Judy Garland basically became America's sweetheart with this movie, and there's a reason. You might like Dorothy in the book, but you fall in love with Dorothy in the movie, so for that reason more than anything, movie gets the point. Next, we look at the pivotal characters in this story: the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion, Dorothy's companions. Not much has really changed here. This story really is essentially about these 3 characters, their time with Dorothy, and how they learn about the gifts that they each possess. Each of these characters believes himself to be deficient in some area. The Scarecrow thinks he's stupid, the Tin Man thinks that he's heartless, and the Cowardly Lion thinks that he's, well, cowardly. And they go to the wizard to rectify this, but throughout the journey we learn for each of them that they each had what they were looking for the whole time. The Scarecrow, I decided, is better in the movie, and I still think so. Now, both Both characters are good. They both pretend that they're unintelligent, but they end up doing most of the thinking and strategizing throughout the journey. In the book, though, this trait is a bit too obvious. Every time the Scarecrow has an idea, it seems like, it's pointed out that, oh, he just thought of something, even though he has no brain. Yeah, we got it, Frank, thanks. In the movie, he does emerge as the strategical thinker, but it's a little more subtle and gradual. He has a few thoughts early on, and then by the end, he's planning Dorothy's rescue. But the more I thought about it, that's not really why I like the movie Scarecrow better. I like the movie Scarecrow better for pretty much the same reason that Dorothy does. He's the best friend that we all wish we could have. He's friendly, he's funny, he's intensely loyal, and even though he doesn't think he's that bright, he stands up for Dorothy and he would do anything for her. I mean, there's a reason why Dorothy said she would miss him most of all. I mean, the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion are good friends too, but the Scarecrow is just so darn likable, and he still takes charge and is a leader when he needs to be. To the point that when he is essentially made ruler of Oz, we actually buy that he'll be an effective leader. The Lion, on the other hand, is better in the book because he actually gets it. The Lion is basically supposed to illustrate that lesson of courage that we've seen in many, many stories since. That courage is not about never being afraid of anything ever, but about facing your fears and doing what you need to do in spite of them. And the book Lion accomplishes this. He thinks that he's a coward because he's scared all the time, but he constantly puts himself into danger for Dorothy's sake, for his friend's sake, and for the sake of the journey to see the wizard. The Lion in the movie is altogether different because he actually is a coward. His default reaction in any scary situation is to run. During the sequence in the Land of the Winkies, he tries to run away no fewer than 3 times, and at one point they literally drag him kicking and screaming back to the action. The lesson of the movie Lion is basically that while bravery might be a virtue, sometimes it's better to save your own neck and not go plunging foolishly into danger. Is this a bad lesson? No, of course not. But it's not a lesson of courage. The wizard himself even says that he's confusing courage with wisdom. Well, then why didn't he give him the badge of wisdom? Again, the character wasn't bad, and he was certainly good for a few laughs, which I think was the intention behind him. He just doesn't provide the lesson of courage that his character was meant to provide. Then yeah, he's a sniveling coward, let's be honest here. And that leaves us once again with the Tin Man, not really a strong presence in either story. Following the pattern of the other characters who each act as though they have deficiencies that they don't actually have, the Tin Man should act heartless but be actually much kinder than he's made out to be. So, basically every main character in a crime drama. That or Sheldon Cooper. The Tin Man in both stories, though, is kind. He's a nice guy, and he doesn't act any different, so why does he think that he needs a heart? Now, a lot of you have commented that they're not going to create an unlikable protagonist in a children's story, and okay, fair enough. But this should still be pointed out, so that more kick-ass retellings like Tin Man can be made. And my former decision still stands. The Tin Man of the book is more competent, stronger, and actually gives a rationale for his kindness despite being heartless. His kindness is purely logical, kind of like Data or Spock from Star Trek, which I guess can be a legitimate characterization. Also, the Tin Man is basically the lovable strongman of the group. He's the indestructible man, or as indestructible as you can be, being made of tin, and he's basically the strongman of the group, which is an interesting irony since he doesn't like killing things. He'll pull out his axe and stand in the way of any oncoming threat, whereas the Tin Man from the movie, yeah, he's kind of a pansy. However, one thing that I really do like about the movie companions is the chemistry between them. They do form something of a bond, and you really get the feeling that the 3 of them are good friends. And it probably also helps that we saw their Kansas counterparts interacting earlier. It works really well, especially given how vastly different they all are. But the book companions have chemistry as well, and moreover, they actually function as a team. In the movie, the Scarecrow is basically the one calling the shots, with the other 2 kind of flanking behind. But in the book, while the Scarecrow is still the strategist, all 3 of them use their gifts. The Scarecrow uses his intelligence, the Tin Man uses his axe and his basic indestructibleness, and the Lion uses his fighting power, all to further the journey and protect Dorothy. So ultimately, the book companions are still better. And now the other Ozian and Kansasian characters. I did toy with the idea of making antagonists one of the new categories and looking deeper into the Wicked Witch of the West, but to be honest, there's really not much more to say than I didn't already say in the other review. In the movie, she's basically an archetypal villain. Power-hungry, threatening, abides in gloom and darkness, uses fire an alarming number of times for someone whose green makeup is flammable, and will do pretty much anything to get what she wants, including kill an innocent girl.
And your little dog, too.
Quite. Also, she's green, and don't forget...
Only bad witches are ugly.
Yeah, we'll be getting to you in a moment. The book Witch of the West isn't nearly as effective as a villain. She's not around as much, she's not as threatening, and she's not nearly as active in getting Dorothy in her shoes. In the movie, the witch appeared at the very beginning to get the shoes and kept going after Dorothy and her companions throughout their journey. The book Witch just waited until they came into her domain, and even then, she just sent out minions to take care of them rather than doing it herself. And when she finally did get Dorothy into her clutches, she just kept her, hoping that she could steal the shoes while she was sleeping or bathing. Now, to be fair, Dorothy was technically under the protection of the Witch of the North, but really, if the Witch of the North's protection is so powerful that it can even protect Dorothy in the Witch of the West's own territory, that doesn't really speak well for the power of the Witch of the West. The book Witch is mostly played up for comedy, whereas the movie Witch is scary as hell. I wasn't lying when I said that she scared the crap out of me as a kid. But then, of course, there are the good witches. The book characters of the Nameless Witch of the North and Glinda, the Witch of the South, are combined into one character in the movie, Glinda the Witch of the North. And I went on a pretty big rant on this particular point in the original review, and this is probably one of the few points where I didn't get a lot of disagreement. Basically, if not for this character, Dorothy's life would not have been put in danger multiple times. Yeah, why didn't she tell Dorothy about the shoes at the beginning again?
Because she wouldn't have believed me.
Now, I will admit that I do like the whole she had the way home with her the whole time thing that they have going here, but seriously? I still do not see how, after being blown to a magical, colorful land by a cyclone, having a bunch of little people hail her as a hero, seeing one witch appear by bubble and another witch appear in fire and smoke and threaten her life, how the idea that she can click her shoes together and get home would somehow be over the line. Even if she was skeptical and didn't believe her, wouldn't it be worth a try? I mean, her life is in danger here. It's a pretty weak explanation, to say the least. At least in the book, the reason why the Witch in the North didn't tell her this is that she legitimately didn't know. Glinda knew, but she was in the South, and she didn't have the ability to travel by bubble. And I do understand the need to consolidate characters a little bit in an adaptation, but it needed to be handled a lot more cleverly than this. The Kansas characters like Annie M, Uncle Henry, and the various parallel characters in the movie are done better in the movie, if for no other reason than we get to spend more time with them and get to know them better. And I do like the parallels that they have between the Kansas characters and the Oz characters. The jokes can get a little corny at times, but they're still good for a chuckle or two. The Wizard is kind of a toss-up for me. I do like the bumbling portrayal in the movie, and he genuinely is a likable guy once he's exposed for who he is. But in the book, he's actually a little cleverer when it comes to bestowing the gifts. The movie Wizard basically gives them keepsakes while explaining that they've always had what they were looking for all along, while the book Wizard actually gives them brains, heart, and courage. Kind of. He basically tricks them into believing that they actually have these things rather than explaining to them that they don't really need them. Now, from a storytelling standpoint, I said last time that I do like the way that the movie approaches this better because they actually learn their lessons. But if you think about it, the book's way of doing this is actually a lot more realistic. How many of us have had that one friend who is convinced that she is stupid or worthless despite all evidence to the contrary and despite all attempts to talk her around? The book Wizard knew that just telling the companions that they didn't need what they were looking for wouldn't cut it. They were so dead set on getting actual brains, heart, and courage that they wouldn't accept anything else. So instead, he tricked them, said that he had actually given them these things, and then their natural gifts came to light and they started behaving like they were smart, kind, and courageous. It is a nice little touch of cleverness on the part of the wizard. For the rest of the characters, my conclusion from the original review is the same. The whole point of this novel is to show us the land and the people who live in it, and the book gives us a lot more history and culture than the movie does. It's nice to learn more about the Munchkins, the Winkies, and the Flying Monkeys, so for that reason, I still like the book characters better. But now it's time to look at one of our new categories, something I didn't start looking at until later reviews, but that definitely deserves to be looked at in this story: composition. The way these two stories are put together is very different. The movie is put together more like a traditional 3-act story. Act 1, Dorothy gets to Oz, walks the yellow brick road, meets her companions, and makes her journey to the Emerald City despite adversity from the Wicked Witch of the West. Act 2, she confronts the wizard and subsequently the Witch of the West and gets herself captured. Act 3, Dorothy is rescued by her companions, they defeat the witch, they expose the wizard, and each of them get what they wanted. Pretty simple, pretty basic. In the book, Baum seems to be giving this story the Odyssey treatment, basically treating it like a 3-part journey around the Land of Oz. First they travel to the Emerald City, and then to the Land of the Winkies, and then finally to the south to see Glinda. Along the way, she discovers all sorts of characters and histories about the Land of Oz. So both compositions do a pretty good job of conveying the type of story that they want to convey. The movie is just trying to tell us a more traditional story, whereas the book is presenting the Land of Oz and everything that it has to offer. And I have to say, the movie does contain its fair share of corner cutting. We already talked about Glinda, but there's also just the whole ending in general. And I'm not just talking about the whole it was all a dream thing, we'll talk about that more in the final round. I mean, here we have this whole story leading up to Dorothy eventually finding the wizard who's supposed to be able to help her to get home. But then that all goes wrong, he disappears, and then just when it seems like her last hope is gone, here comes Glinda to say, poof, I'll fix everything and make it better. And then she's home. I don't know, it just seems really weak to me. I mean, the journey may have gone on a little bit too long in the book, but at least there was that sense of accomplishment at the end. The trouble with the book's composition, though, is that it just doesn't feel like a story. It's a bit too long, it makes points over and over again, and once the witch is defeated and the wizard is exposed, you kind of feel like the story should end there, but there's still more journey to make. There's also the whole rule of three thing, but I'll get to that later in story. Now there is one aspect of the composition that I feel the need to talk about just because it's one of the most frequent complaints I get on the original review. And that is the alleged allegory. In 1964, historian Henry Littlefield published an article that basically outlined a lot of allegorical parallels between Baum's story and the political and economic situation of the Gilded Age in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Since then, historians and analysts have gone nuts trying to find the hidden allegory in The Wizard of Oz. A number of people have commented saying I should have taken the allegory into account in my original review, and as it happens, I did know about the allegory and I even read up on it a bit, but ultimately I decided not to include it in the review, and it's for one very simple reason. The allegory is stupid. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of comments for that remark, but just hear me out. First of all, these allegorical parallels didn't come to light until over 60 years after the book was published, well beyond the point when they were relevant. Second, no one can agree on exactly what some of the elements are supposed to symbolize. And some of the conclusions are shoddy at best, like they're really pushing the boundaries of plausibility here. For an allegory to work, you want it to be obvious. Like everyone knows that Animal Farm is about communism, and everyone knows that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the story of the gospel. Third, just because a story has a lot of symbolic elements or parallels to things that were going on at the time, that doesn't make it an allegory. I have no doubt that Baum threw in a few of those symbolic things to things that were going on at the time. But honestly, I think those were more like inside jokes to the adults that were reading the story to their kids. Fourth, even if the story is allegorical, it should not undermine the quality of the story itself. Even if you don't know that Aslan is supposed to be Jesus, you still get the message of sacrifice and standing up for what you believe in that story. Even if you don't know that the pigs are communists, you still get the message that the rebels became just as oppressive as the people that they overthrew. If The Wizard of Oz is an allegory, what exactly is it trying to say? That these things existed? Bottom line, I don't buy the allegory. I think a lot of people are reading way too much into a very simple children's story.
My girlfriend, the social studies major, would like to point out that if the allegory exists, it is an economic allegory and is therefore not as interesting as a story-based allegory, which doesn't help the book's case much.
Does it have historical and cultural significance? Oh, absolutely. But it should be perfectly clear by now, I don't judge stories based solely on their historical significance. I judge stories based on the quality of the story and how well it is held up over time. And in this case, the composition of the movie stood the test of time much better than the long and dull composition of the book. So now we'll look at the way that these two stories made the imagination come alive in Imagery. Not much has changed here. Both Baum and the movie have good imagery. Baum has a way of writing that not only makes it seem like he's right there telling you the story, but also makes the Land of Oz come alive a little bit. I've now said in a couple of other reviews that I really like this style of storytelling, where it feels like the narrator is right there telling you the story. And Baum also has a way of making the characters seem a lot more realistic, at least as far as their personalities are concerned. The characters actually have flaws that can sometimes get a little annoying, which helps teach children lessons about manners and so on. Yeah, but as we've talked about in other reviews, Baum is not exactly subtle. I mean, he got better with subsequent novels, but a lot of the lessons are really in your face. I mean, maybe that's just the way it is with children's books, but some of the lessons are kind of forced. And what I still really appreciate about the movie is its ability to create completely different atmospheres. The book is basically on the same tone for the whole time. I mean, yeah, they're captured by the witch for a while, but that's only for a few chapters, and like I said, the witch was played up more for comedy. The rest of the book is just happy and wonderful, which, okay, I understand, it's a children's book, and at the time they weren't quite ready to to introduce dark elements to kids. I get that. But again, I'm not judging the book based on how it worked at the time. I'm judging the book based on how well it stood up to the test of time, and I really don't think that it did. Now the movie, that's another matter. They create a lot of different atmospheres. There are plenty of moments when everything is just happy and wonderful, but there are a lot of dark, creepy elements as well. The wizard isn't just wonderful and awe-inspiring, he's freaking scary. The woods where they find the lion and the land of the Winkies are also scary. And we really think that Dorothy is in danger of losing her life. I know I didn't want to find out what happened when that hourglass ran out. And those elements are still capable of inspiring wonder and fright today, which is one of the big reasons why this movie is still considered as great as it is. I mean, yeah, not everything looks exactly real, but remember, this is supposed to be a dream, not an actual place, so that kind of makes sense. So as before, movie has the better imagery. And now another category to consider, the wonderful Land of Oz itself. This is something I didn't really start doing until much later in the series, but a lot of fantasy stories take place in other lands, like Narnia, Middle-earth, Fantasia.
Get on with it!
Thanks, Wheezy. And one of the things that makes these stories so memorable is how they convey the lands themselves. I did talk about this a little bit in the previous review, tying it in with other characters and imagery and so on, but this really does deserve its own category, because let's face it, this is basically why the book was written. And it seems like, given my opinion of this particular book, there's a misperception that I don't like Oz at all, and that's not true. I love Oz. I am fascinated by it. I don't think this particular book is very good, but I love the idea and I love the effect it's had on our culture. Baum created a rich and detailed world with a lot of diversity and a lot of colorful characters. Everything from talking animals to men made of china. Now that history, of course, became a lot more in-depth in subsequent novels with the introduction of Ozma and so on, but even in this novel, the histories are incredibly detailed. We learn more about the Munchkins, the Winkies, and the Flying Monkeys, as well as looking deeper into the histories of our companions. The one thing I will say in the movie's favor is that it does at times add a touch of realism. Baum's Land of Oz is detailed, but at times it kind of borders on silly. I mean, I guess that is kind of the point, especially when looking at the people of the Emerald City and their green tinted glasses. It is kind of supposed to illustrate the silliness, but at times it does kind of distract from the story. But again, the focus of this book is not really on the story, but on the land. Anytime an author includes a map of the world in the front of the book, I get really excited. I spent a lot of time just looking at the map and trying to figure out what places we're going to visit or possibly not visit. Exploring a different world is one of the most fun aspects of fantasy stories for me, and this world is about as zany and creative as you can get. Also, as we stated before, Oz in the movie is by all indications just a dream, whereas here, it's the real thing. So, by far, the book's portrayal is better. As usual, it's all tied up, and it's time to look once again at story. So I'm not going to do the whole rule of 3 game again, although as it happens I do need to correct one pretty major mistake I made in the original review. When I was talking about the various things that the companions had to fight off in the Land of Winkies, I said that when the crows came, the Scarecrow scared them off and then the Tin Man killed them. This is in fact not what happened. The Scarecrow did try to scare them off, but when the crows came back, he wrung their necks. Nice image for a children's story. This does mean that the Scarecrow took on what had previously mocked him, the Tin Man used his construction to his advantage with the bees, and the lion roared down the Winkies. Okay, so it's a little closer to adhering to the rule of 3, but it's still not quite there, because before any of that happens, there is a pack of wolves that the Tin Man takes care of. Why? If they had just eliminated the wolves, or the bees for that matter, then each of the 3 companions would have faced one of these threats using their gifts to their advantage, and it would have worked great. But as it was, the Tin Man fought off 2 attackers and everyone else just fought off 1. It's the same with the different forms of the wizard. He was so close to getting it right. Having the wizard become a ball of fire for the Scarecrow just makes perfect sense to me. Given its fear of fire, it just seems really obvious, and the beast and the woman for the lion and the Tin Man respectively seem pretty obvious as well. But that's not what happens. Even as a kid, that moment didn't really make much sense to me at the time, though admittedly I couldn't really articulate why. But as we've already talked about, the movie is not without its weaknesses as well. It actually contains a couple of examples of how not to do an adaptation, like weakening the 2 witches by combining them into one character, or weakening the ending by just having Glinda appear and make everything okay. I mean, say what you will about Dorothy's blandness in the book, but she worked for her solution. She journeyed all over Oz in order to get home, Whereas in the movie, all Dorothy really had to do was state a lesson, which incidentally she had already learned. Also, let's really look at this whole "it was all a dream" thing. This has become one of the biggest cliches in storytelling now, but did it work even then? It's kind of hard to say looking at it from a modern perspective, but it still seems like kind of a cop-out to me. Like, rather than have Dorothy actually find a solution to her problem, they just have her wake up. But on the other hand, she doesn't actually wake up until she finds out about the shoes, so I guess the weakness isn't so much in the fact that it was all a dream, but the fact that Glinda just told her about the shoes. There's also the confusing strangeness of the final message, which is basically there's no place like home and I'm never gonna leave here ever again, which I think would terrify Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, but no matter. But what makes this weird is that immediately after she says this, they start playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, a song which basically says the exact opposite. It's about going out and finding magical new places, and yet it is so strongly associated with this movie. And at the same time, so is the phrase, "there's no place like home." Kind of a confusing mixed message, wouldn't you say, Hatter? Indeed I would, Reg. But in the end, I'm still gonna give the point to movie because it just tells a better story. It's more coherent, better structured, has some great timeless songs, and creates great atmospheres, both bright and dark where appropriate. And even though it is all technically a dream, it somehow feels more real to me than the book, just because our characters do actually seem like they're in danger at times. There are some bad guys in the book, but ultimately we know that everything's gonna be okay. In the movie, there are times when things get really scary, especially for little kids. And for those of you who are getting ready to say that the book is more child-friendly and the movie is actually too scary at times, respectfully, shut up. We seem to have entered into a disturbing mindset where we think that children should never be scared of anything ever, and if we somehow expose them to a story that scares them, it'll scar them for life. And you know what? It will. They'll get scared, they'll hide, they'll cry a little, and then they'll get over it. That is how kids grow, and you might be saying, well, shouldn't we let kids be kids? Well, kids get scared. I was scared by a lot of things as a kid. Willy Wonka scared me, the second act of Into the Woods scared me, and this scared me. And you know what? I don't feel like my childhood was sacrificed. And the funny thing is, once I got over my fear of these stories and was able to actually watch them all the way through, I loved them. I couldn't get enough of them. I felt like a grown-up because I was watching something that I had once been terrified of. And I think that's why this movie aged as well as it did. It gives you the overwhelming sense that things could go wrong, and that's frightening. But it gives you an even more overwhelming sense that everything will be alright, and that is heartening. The book really doesn't get dark enough to bring about these feelings. It's just a nice story. And I don't know, maybe it left a deeper impression on your childhood, but it didn't leave much of one on mine. Certainly not the kind that the movie did. So, as previously stated, I do think that the movie tells the better story.